"Which of you is Miss Odette Lachlan?" The clerk asked it out loud, in a magistrate's anteroom in Cumberland, and the room went silent enough to hear the clock on the wall tick twice. Two women stood at the bench, same height, same brown eyes, same trembling hands folded the same way, dressed almost alike, down to the pearl combs in their hair. A constable by the door shifted his weight, uncertain where to look. A clerk's pen hovered over a blank line on a form that required by law a name. For one held breath, nobody in that room could tell them apart. Not the clerk, not the constable, not even for one terrible second, the viewer watching this story unfold. One of the women smiled first. It was a small smile, practiced, the kind of smile that had opened doors and closed mouths for weeks. The other woman did not smile at all. Her hands were raw and cracked at the knuckles, the hands of someone who had scrubbed silver every day for a month. On the little finger of her left hand there was a hard yellow callus, built up over 18 years of piano practice. Nobody in that room knew yet what that small mark of skin would prove, but it would prove everything. This story started 3 weeks earlier, on the morning of an engagement party, in a house where a woman woke up and discovered she no longer existed. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Now rewind, 3 weeks before that magistrate's bench, the morning it began. Lachlan Hall sat gray and handsome above the Cumberland Fells, its windows lit gold that morning, because tonight the house would host an engagement party. Miss Odette Lachlan, 24 years old, woke in her own bed, in her own room, and did not yet know her whole life had already been taken from her while she slept. She reached for her ring on the nightstand. It was gone. She sat up. Her dressing gown was gone from its hook. In its place hung a gown she did not recognize. She rang for her maid. Nobody came for 11 minutes. When the door finally opened, it was not her maid. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, carrying folded linens, and she stopped dead in the doorway and stared at Odette like she was looking at a ghost. "Miss Colette said you might wander in here," Mrs. Pruitt said carefully. "She said you sometimes forget which room is yours." Odette laughed, because surely this was a joke. "This is my room, Mrs. Pruitt. I was born in this room. Miss Odette's room is down the East Hall now, miss," Mrs. Pruitt said. Her eyes did not blink. "You're in Miss Colette's room." Odette's stomach turned to ice. "I am Odette." Mrs. Pruitt did not answer that. She simply backed out of the doorway quickly, the way a person backs away from something they do not want to touch. Odette ran. Down the corridor, past portraits of her own grandfather, to the room that had been hers since she was 6 years old. She threw the door open without knocking. Her twin sister Colette was sitting at Odette's own vanity mirror, in Odette's own robe, wearing Odette's own engagement ring on her finger, brushing her hair with Odette's own silver-backed brush. "Odette," Colette said, and stood, and her voice cracked with what sounded exactly like relief. "Thank heaven, we were so worried." "What are you doing?" Odette's voice came out flat and small. "What are you wearing?" "That is my ring." Colette's face folded into something gentle and sad, the face of a woman looking at someone very fragile. "Darling, you gave me this ring yourself last night. Don't you remember? You said you couldn't bear the weight of the engagement. You said you wanted me to carry it for a while. I said no such thing. You've had these spells before," Colette said softly, and reached out a hand like she wanted to touch Odette's cheek. "Ever since Lucerne." The word Lucerne hit Odette like a slap, because Lucerne was real. Lucerne was a scandal, a genuine one, 3 years old, except it had not been Odette's scandal. It had been Colette's. Colette had gambled away money that was not hers in a hotel in Lucerne and fled in the night. And Odette, because she loved her twin more than she loved her own reputation, had written the letters home that covered it. Odette had told their aunt it was her own nerves. Odette had told the family doctor it was her own fainting fits. Odette had built, brick by brick, with her own hands, a story that made herself look unstable so that Colette would look untouched. And now Colette was holding that very story up like a mirror. "You are the one who was in Lucerne," Odette said, backing toward the door. "Not me. Never me." "Fetch a doctor," Colette said, not to Odette, over Odette's shoulder to the housemaid now standing frozen in the corridor. "Fetch a doctor for the poor girl. She has these spells. Be gentle with her. She doesn't mean it." The housemaid curtsied to Colette, not to Odette, curtsied, and hurried away to fetch a doctor for the mad maid down the hall. That was the moment Odette understood the ground under her feet was gone. She ran back to what should have been her own room and tore open the wardrobe, searching for anything in her own hand that had not already been copied and turned against her. The wardrobe held only Colette's trunks, freshly unpacked from the continent. Her own gowns had been moved to a servant's closet off the kitchen stairs sometime in the night, folded there like laundry waiting to be given away. She found one thing the searchers had missed: a small tin box under a loose floorboard, hidden since she was 12, holding a lock of their mother's hair, a photograph of the two girls at age 6, and a single sheet of music in her own hand. The piece she had composed at 19 and shown to no one. She pressed the tin box to her chest and understood, with a cold, sinking certainty, that this small box was very nearly the only proof left in the world that Odette Lachlan had ever existed at all. She spent that whole morning trying to make someone, anyone, listen. She cornered the butler, Mr. Wren, in the hall. "I am Odette Lachlan. Look at me. You have known me since I was 6 years old." Mr. Wren's face was pale and careful, a man walking on ice. "Miss Colette explained the situation to the staff last evening, miss. About your condition." "There is no condition." "The papers are already drawn, miss," he said gently. "The engagement announcement, the guest list, everything in Miss Odette's hand and signature." "Whose hand? Whose signature?" "Colette can forge my handwriting. She has done it since we were children, copying my schoolwork." "Please, miss," Mr. Wren said, and there was real pity in his voice, and that pity was somehow worse than cruelty. "Don't make this harder on yourself." She went to the family solicitor's letters in the study desk and found them already altered, dated, and signed, in her own hand, or a hand so like it that even she, staring at it, felt a cold worm of doubt crawl into her own certainty. She found her old letters about Lucerne, the one she had written herself to protect her sister, now produced by Colette as evidence. You see how she invents illness for herself. She always has. Poor Odette. She tried one more person before noon, her aunt, Mrs. Iris Thorne, who had raised the girls after their mother died and who had known both twins longer than anyone alive. She found her aunt in the morning room, already seated with Colette, already halfway through a pot of tea. "Aunt Iris," Odette said, and her voice cracked on the word. "It's me. It's Odette. Look at my hands. Look at the ink stain on my thumb. I've had it since Tuesday, from the household accounts." She wouldn't know where that stain came from. Mrs. Thorne looked at her for a long moment, and for one flickering second, Odette thought she saw recognition. Then Colette spoke first, gently, sadly. "She's been saying things like this since dawn, Aunt Iris. I didn't want to frighten you with it at breakfast." "I am not confused," Odette said. "I am not ill. I am your niece, and she has taken my ring and my room, and now she is taking my own aunt." "Darling girl," Mrs. Thorne said to Odette, and her voice was kind, and that kindness was a door closing. "Nobody is taking anything from you. You are tired. The wedding excitement has always undone you, ever since you were small. It had never undone her. It was Colette who wept and fainted and needed carrying to bed before every dance of their girlhood. But the story had already been rewritten, and rewritten stories, Odette was learning, are harder to argue against than lies, because the people around you want so very badly to believe the kind version. By noon it was decided, in the quiet, terrible way that households decide things without ever holding a vote. The real Odette Lachlan was a servant with delusions, kept on out of Christian charity, because the family did not wish to turn a sick girl into the street. She would be given a small wage and a room off the kitchen stairs. She would help with tonight's party, since extra hands were needed, and it would do her good. Everyone agreed to keep busy. She was handed an apron. She put it on with hands that would not stop shaking, because the alternative was to be thrown out of the only home she had ever known, with no name anyone would believe was hers, 3 days before the biggest night of her actual life. By 6 o'clock that evening, Lackland Hall's great hall glittered with candlelight and champagne, and 80 guests in silk and jewels. And Odette Lackland stood in the butler's pantry in a gray dress and white apron, polishing the family silver, silver engraved, every piece of it with her own initials, O.L., pressed into the metal the year she turned 18. Odette came into the pantry that morning already wearing a stranger's gray dress that Mrs. Pruitt had found for her, and she stood in front of the cabinet of family silver. Silver engraved, every piece of it, with her own initials, O.L., pressed into the metal the year she turned 18, and began, because there was nothing else in the world left for her to do, to polish it for the party that would celebrate her own name being stolen. Through the door she could hear the toast begin. "To Odette," Lord Evander Sherwood said, lifting his glass in the candlelit hall, "the cleverest woman I have ever met, and the only one who has ever beaten me at chess." Upstairs, in the hall, Colette Lackland lifted the very ring that had been taken off Odette's nightstand and smiled at 80 strangers as if she had won something. In a way, she had. "To Odette," the room repeated, and glasses rang together like small bells, and down in the pantry a woman named Odette Lackland polished her own engagement silver and heard her own name toasted by a room that did not know she was standing 30 feet away. Nobody watching that toast noticed the small ring of steward Simon Bird's eyes, narrowing very slightly as he studied the bride's hand around her champagne glass. He said nothing. Not yet, but valets notice things nobody else bothers to notice. And Simon Bird had already noticed something wrong with the way the new Miss Lackland held a fork. An hour into the party, Odette was sent up with a fresh tray of glasses, and for one unbearable minute she stood at the edge of the great hall itself, in her apron, holding a tray, 3 feet from the man she had loved through 11 months of letters. Lord Evander glanced her way once, the polite, unseeing glance a gentleman gives any servant in a crowded room, and looked straight through her, and turned back to laugh at something Colette had said. It cut deeper than any insult Colette had thrown at her all day, because it was not cruelty. It was simply not seeing her at all. Colette came into the pantry near 10 o'clock, flushed with champagne and triumph, and set down an empty glass in front of Odette without even looking at her properly. "Careful with those, girl," she said. "They're engraved." Odette's hand tightened so hard around the polishing cloth that her knuckles went white. "I know," she said quietly. "I chose the pattern myself, when I was 18. Something flickered behind Colette's eyes. Not guilt. Guilt would have been too kind a word. Something closer to irritation. The irritation of a woman stepping over a puddle she had not quite planned for. "How industrious you are," she said, and swept back out to her own party, the ring on her finger catching the candlelight the whole way. Odette stood alone with the silver and did not cry. She had promised herself, standing in that pantry at 6 o'clock, that she would not cry in this house again until she had her name back. The days after the party were worse in a quieter way. Cruelty at a dinner table is loud. Cruelty stretched across a week is a slow drip, and it soaks in deeper. Colette began, in small gatherings over tea, to retell the sisters' childhood, with herself recast as the heroine of every story. "Do you remember?" she said one afternoon to Lady Maud Sherwood, Evander's grandmother, "when I taught myself to swim in the lake at Grasmere, and Odette was too frightened to follow, and cried on the bank until Papa carried her in himself? It had happened exactly backward. Odette had taught herself to swim that summer, alone, stubborn, refusing help, while Colette stood on the bank shrieking that the water was too cold. Odette, standing near the doorway with a tea tray because the parlor maid was ill that day, felt the story land like a slap she could not answer because answering it as a servant would only prove she was exactly as unstable as everyone already believed. One of the younger guests, new to the county and unaware of the household's private tragedy, glanced toward the maid at the doorway and asked, not unkindly, "Does your girl there ever correct you when you tell these old stories? She has the look of someone who remembers things differently." Colette laughed, warm and easy, and reached out as if to pat Odette's arm, though she did not quite touch her. Poor thing. She has always imagined herself me. We indulge it. It's kinder than arguing. The guests laughed softly along with her, the gentle laugh of people being let in on a small, sad family joke. And Odette stood holding her tray and said nothing at all, because there was nothing a maid could say in that room that would not prove the joke correct. Lady Maud, 77 years old and sharp as a hatpin, set down her teacup with a small, precise click. "How generous of you," she said to Colette in a voice as sweet as sugar and twice as hard. "In my day we indulged imagination at the pianoforte. Perhaps after supper, both of you might play something." Nobody in the room understood yet why the offer made Colette's smile falter for half a second before she recovered it. Lady Maud understood. She had already begun, quietly, developed across 7 decades of watching people lie to her, a habit of saying nothing useful in the moment and writing everything down that night. Every guest in that parlor nodded along with the swimming story anyway. Every single one. The viewer watching this unfold understood something the guests did not. This was not memory. This was theft, rehearsed and delivered smiling, in front of witnesses who would repeat it as fact for years. That night, Colette found Odette alone in the pantry, and for once dropped the performance entirely, since there was no audience left to perform for. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and studied her twin the way a cat studies something already caught. "You could make this so much easier," Colette said. "On both of us. Stop looking at me like that at breakfast. Stop flinching every time I tell a story." "They are my stories," Odette said quietly, not looking up from the tray of glasses she was drying. "My swimming, my mother's illness, my whole life, Colette. You didn't even change the details. You just put yourself where I stood." "Because nobody ever put me anywhere," Colette snapped, and for one unguarded second there was real heat under the words, old and long buried. "Do you know what it is? To stand next to you your whole life? The clever one, the talented one, the one who never needed covering for, except that one time in Lucerne, which I notice you have never once let me forget. I never once brought it up," Odette said. "You did, just now." Colette's jaw tightened. She said nothing else, and left the pantry, and the silence she left behind was worse than any insult would have been, because for one moment Odette had almost recognized something like her sister underneath all the rehearsal, and had not liked very much what she recognized. That was the pattern now. Every few days, another memory quietly stolen and repainted. The story of who broke the greenhouse window as children, the story of who nursed their mother through her final illness. Each time, Colette took the version that made her generous, brave or wronged, and left Odette the leftover, smaller, meaner shape of the same event, and each time a room full of decent people nodded along, because why on earth would a woman lie about her own childhood in front of 80 witnesses? Odette began, quietly, desperately, to gather proof she had almost nothing. Her own signature had been imitated too well. Her own scandal cover stories had been turned into weapons against her. What she had was time, a servant's invisibility, and access to rooms nobody watched a maid walk into. It was in Lord Evander's study. 12 days after the swap, dusting a shelf nobody had asked her to dust, that she found the letter that changed everything. She had been given the study to clean only because the regular housemaid had come down with a fever, and Odette had volunteered quickly quietly, before anyone could think to send someone else. She had hoped only to find some scrap of her own past there, an old letter, a photograph, anything to hold on to. What she found instead was tucked inside a folded newspaper from the continent, a paper Colette must have brought with her, and then, in a rare, careless moment, left behind among Evander's correspondence. It was written in French, addressed to a solicitor in Zurich, and it took Odette 3 read-throughs, with her hand pressed over her mouth to understand what it meant. Her French had always been better than Colette's. Another small fact nobody in this house seemed to remember anymore, and she translated the careful, lawyerly sentences again and again until the shape of the scheme sat cold and solid in her stomach. Colette was not in England to marry Lord Evander Sherwood. Colette was in England to become someone the law could not touch. There was a fraud warrant open against her on the continent. Money taken from investors in a shipping venture that never existed. A warrant written under yet another name Colette had used in Lucerne, and after, a Madame Fontaine who had vanished from a hotel in that same city 3 years before with 11,000 francs that were never hers. A warrant could not follow a woman who had legally, publicly, with witnesses and a marriage settlement and a bishop's blessing, become Lady Sherwood. A new name, a new legal identity, bought with a wedding instead of a bank draft. A husband whose family's lawyers would fight to protect their own name before they ever handed a runaway bride to a foreign court. The marriage was never about love, or money, or even revenge on her sister. The marriage was a legal disappearing act. Sign the settlement, take the funds transferred in her married name, and vanish before the ink dried on the register, leaving an innocent man ruined by scandal and a fortune lighter, and leaving the real Odette permanently buried under the name of a madwoman. Odette sat on the floor of that study, with the letter shaking in her hands, and understood, for the first time, that she was no longer fighting only for her name. She was fighting to save a man she had once loved with her whole conversation, if not yet her whole heart, from signing his life away to a woman who would be gone within the hour of the ink drying. And she understood something else, colder and harder to admit. To prove any of this to anyone who mattered, a solicitor, a magistrate, Lord Evander himself, she would need more than one careless letter left in a newspaper. She would need to know what Evander himself believed, and when, and whether his own letters to the woman he thought was his fiancée contained some other proof, some slip, some date, some detail that would close the trap for good. She had sworn to herself, her whole life, never to read another person's private letters. It was the one rule she had never broken, even for Colette, even in the worst of the Lucerne years, when she had wanted so very badly to know what her sister was truly capable of and had never once opened a locked drawer to find out. It was, she had always believed, the plainest test of decency a person could set for herself, that some doors stayed closed even when nobody was watching to see whether you opened them. That night, in the dark of the pantry, with the letter to Zurich folded inside her apron pocket, she stood outside the door of Evander's study for 11 long minutes, her hand on the latch, arguing with herself in the dark. She thought of the 80 guests who had toasted a stranger with her name. She thought of a bank draft dated for the morning after a wedding that would ruin a man who had never done anything to deserve it. And she opened the door. She read 2 of his letters, meant for Colette's eyes only, searching only for proof, touching nothing else on the desk, replacing each page exactly as she found it. She found what she needed. A line about the wedding date, a line about funds already being quietly transferred ahead of the settlement, small facts that would matter enormously to a solicitor soon. She also found the exact shape of the line she had just stepped over, and she did not feel clean about it. Not for 1 second, not even long afterward when she told the story herself. She closed the desk drawer softly and stood for a long moment in the dark study with her hand pressed flat against the wood, the same gesture Simon Bird would later notice her making outside the locked music room. Though neither of them yet knew that, the house did not slow down to let her feel guilty. It sped up. 3 days after she found the Zurich letter, Lachlan Hall hosted a garden party for 40 guests, croquet on the south lawn, iced lemonade, and the Sherwood family's old wolfhound, Baron, who had known Odette since he was a puppy and had never once in his life growled at her. Odette was set to carrying trays of lemonade across the lawn all afternoon, weaving between guests in silk and summer hats who did not glance at her twice. She watched Colette laugh too loudly at a joke Lord Evander had not quite finished telling, watched her reach for his arm at exactly the wrong moment in the story. A beat too early, the timing of someone performing affection rather than feeling it. Nobody else on that lawn seemed to notice. Odette noticed everything now. It was the only power left to her. Partway through a game of croquet, Colette called Odette over by name, the wrong name, girl, in front of a dozen guests, to fetch a shawl from the house. And when Odette returned a moment too slowly, breathless from hurrying, Colette held out her hand for the shawl without a word of thanks and remarked to the lady beside her, just loudly enough to carry, "One does have to make allowances." She was never quite quick enough, even before her troubles started. The lady beside her murmured something sympathetic, and Odette stood holding the empty tray and swallowed the words rising in her throat, because there was no version of defending herself that would not, in that crowd, confirm exactly what Colette wanted them to believe. Colette walked across that lawn in a new silk dress paid for on the Lachlan account, and Baron rose from where he lay in the shade, hackles lifting along his spine, and growled, long, low, unmistakable, at the woman wearing Odette's ring. "Baron! Down, you foolish creature," Lord Evander said, laughing, embarrassed, pulling the dog back by his collar. "He's never done that in his life. I do apologize, my darling. Perhaps he doesn't care for lavender water," a guest joked, and the moment passed the way moments pass at garden parties, quickly, smoothed over by laughter and lemonade. Colette laughed along with them, a beat too loud, and reached down to pat the dog's head. Baron pulled his head away from her hand entirely and pressed himself instead against the skirts of the maid, passing by with a tray of empty glasses, and licked her fingers once before Odette hurried on, heart hammering, praying nobody had watched a dog choose a servant over a bride. Lady Maud had watched. Lady Maud watched everything. That evening, over tea in the small parlor, she handed her granddaughter's fiancé the teapot and said, in the mildest voice imaginable, "Would you pour, my dear?" Colette poured, smiling, graceful, every gesture rehearsed to perfection. Then she reached for the sugar bowl and dropped 2 lumps into her own cup, stirring twice, the way she always had, the way she had done every single day of her life. Lady Maud said nothing. She had taken tea with the real Odette Lachlan on 4 separate occasions over the past 2 years, and Odette Lachlan had never once, not a single time, taken sugar in her tea. Lady Maud finished her cup, complimented the sandwiches, and went upstairs that night and wrote a letter to her own solicitor and to a private inquiry agent she had used once before, years ago when a nephew's fortune was nearly stolen by a man who was not who he claimed to be. At that very same hour, in the servants' hall, Simon Bird, Lord Evander's valet, sat polishing his master's boots and thinking about hands. He had noticed it 3 weeks running now. The bride's hands, soft and unmarked, moving over the piano keys during evening entertainments with confidence, but without a single callus, without the telltale flattened patch of hard skin that 18 years of daily scales leaves on a serious pianist's smallest finger. He remembered, from 2 years back, hearing his master describe the real Odette's hands exactly that way. In a letter Evander had once read aloud to him half in jest. "She has a callus on her littlest finger, Bird, from the piano, and she is prouder of it than of any ring I could ever give her." Bird had thought nothing of it at the time. He thought of nothing else now. He had also noticed, twice now, passing the little used music room off the east corridor, the new lady's maid, the sad, quiet one, the one the housekeeper spoke of with pity, standing outside its locked door with an expression like a starving woman looking through a bakery window. He watched her hand rest flat against the wood of the door for a long moment before she walked on, as though she were saying goodbye to something. Simon Bird did not know yet what he was looking at. But he was a valet, and valets notice hands and habits, and which twin a good dog refuses to sit beside, and he had begun without telling a soul, leaving the music room door quietly unlocked at night. Odette found it unlocked on a Tuesday. She told herself she would only look. She sat down at the piano instead, in the dark, and played 4 bars of a piece she had composed herself at 19. The only piece in the world that existed nowhere on paper, only in her own hands and her own memory, before she caught herself and fled back to her cold room off the kitchen stairs, heart-pounding, terrified someone had heard. Someone had. Simon Bird stood in the corridor outside, in the dark, and did not move for a long time after the music stopped. He went to his own small room that night and wrote down, in a plain notebook he kept for his master's household accounts, 4 words that had nothing to do with accounts at all. The maid plays Odette's piece. The mini gratitudes came, small and sharp, like pinpricks that told the viewer the larger reckoning was already loading its powder. At a dinner 2 nights later, Colette, reaching too quickly for a second helping of a dish she had never in her life liked, discovered too late that Odette had always hated turbot and choked slightly and had to leave the table for a moment while 3 guests exchanged a glance nobody explained. A scheme to sell off a parcel of Lachlan land to fund the wedding expenses collapsed when the family solicitor, an old friend of Odette's late father, quietly refused to process the paperwork without a face-to-face meeting. Colette kept finding excuses to avoid, and in the kitchen, the cook, Mrs. Aldous, who had known both twins since they were in the nursery, began, carefully, silently, telling no one, saving the good end of the loaf for the sad new maid, and slipping her an extra half hour by the fire in the evenings, because something in her old bones did not believe the story she had been told to believe. There was a smaller humiliation too, one that made the servants' hall whisper for 2 full days afterward. Colette, attempting to seat herself at the head of the long table for a family luncheon, mistook the worn groove in the old chair's leather, a groove shaped, over years, to Odette's particular way of sitting, and shifted twice, visibly uncomfortable, unable to settle into a seat that had never once fit her own body. She snapped at a footman to bring a cushion, sharply, publicly, and the footman fetched one without a word, but 3 other servants in that room caught each other's eyes across the table and said nothing at all, which in a house full of secrets was its own kind of loud. None of it was proof yet. All of it was pressure building under a lid that would not hold much longer. 9 days before the settlement was due to be signed, Lady Maud's inquiry agent's letter arrived, delivered to her privately, at breakfast, and she read it twice at the table without changing her expression by one muscle, then folded it into her sleeve and asked for more toast. The letter confirmed, in the flat, dry language of professional men, everything Lady Maud had already begun to suspect from a dog and a sugar bowl, a continental fraud warrant, a Madame Fontaine of Lucerne, a woman answering precisely to Colette Lachlan's description, who had vanished from 3 different cities in 3 years, each time 1 step ahead of a magistrate. The agent had also, at Lady Maud's request, made careful and quiet inquiries at the Lachlan household itself, and had turned up 2 housemaids and a footman willing, for a price far smaller than their consciences ought to have demanded, to swear that the sad new maid was the one prone to delusions. That night she summoned Simon Bird to her private sitting room, an unusual thing for a dowager to do, and asked him one question. "The new lady's maid," she said. "Does she play the piano?" Simon Bird, who had spent his whole career learning when silence served his master, and when it did not, told her everything he had noticed. The hands, the callus he had glimpsed once, cleaning silver on the maid's smallest finger. The music heard once, in the dark, 4 bars of something he had never heard before and never forgot: the dog. Lady Maud listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said only, "Say nothing to my grandson yet. Say nothing to anyone. We will need a room full of witnesses, Bird, or none of them will ever believe it. A quiet truth in this house dies quietly. We will make this one loud." She spent that following days arranging it exactly as a general arranges a battle. She wrote to her own solicitor in London, requesting the 2 gentlemen who handled matters of continental warrants be present at the settlement signing, seated as ordinary guests, told nothing of the plan except when to stand. She wrote a second letter, warmer, to Odette herself. The first time in 3 weeks anyone in that house had addressed her by her true name in writing, instructing her, in careful coded language a maid alone might read twice before understanding, to be present in the great hall on the night of the signing, and to bring, if she still had it, anything at all in her own hand that might prove who she was. Odette read that letter 3 times by candlelight, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed off the kitchen stairs, and for the first time in 3 weeks she allowed herself to cry, not from grief this time, but from the strange, aching relief of being believed by someone who mattered. There was one more thread quietly pulling loose that week, one Lady Maud had not arranged at all. Lord Evander himself had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to feel a small and persistent wrongness in the woman he was to marry. She laughed at his jokes a beat too late, as though translating them first. She had stopped asking him about the chess games they used to play by letter, the ones she had once beaten him at twice running, and grew strangely quiet whenever he set up the board. One evening he mentioned, in passing, a particular Chopin nocturne she had once written to him about with real feeling, and watched her face go carefully, briefly blank before she recovered, and agreed that yes, of course, she loved it dearly. He said nothing of these small wrongnesses to anyone. He only found himself, more and more, standing near doorways a moment longer than necessary, watching his own engagement the way a man watches weather that might turn. The settlement signing was arranged for the following week, in the great hall of Lachlan Hall, before nearly 100 guests, family, solicitors from both sides, the bishop who would perform the wedding, and half the county who had been invited because a settlement signing before a society wedding was, in 1909 Cumberland, very nearly as good as the wedding itself for entertainment. It was, everyone agreed, going to be the finest gathering Lachlan Hall had hosted in a generation. Colette dressed for it in a gown the color of champagne, the ring catching every candle in the room, and did not know that the guest list that night had been quietly altered by one addition Lady Maud had made herself. 2 gentlemen from a solicitor's firm in London who specialized, discreetly, in matters involving foreign warrants and the persons who ran from them, seated near the back, dressed like ordinary guests, waiting, the great hall filled. Candles burned in every sconce, doubled in the tall windows against the dark spring night outside. Champagne circulated on silver trays, the very silver Odette had polished with her own 2 hands 3 weeks before. The settlement papers sat on a small table near the fireplace, thick cream pages, a fortune's worth of ink waiting for a single signature. Lord Evander stood beside them, smiling, believing with his whole open heart that the woman across from him was the woman he had fallen in love with over 11 months of letters and long conversations and one memorable, furious game of chess. Odette Lachlan stood at the back of the hall in her gray dress and white apron, holding a tray of empty glasses, because a servant's job on the night of a settlement signing is to be invisible, and she had learned, these 3 weeks, exactly how invisible a person's own life can make her. In her apron pocket, folded small, she carried the tin box from under the floorboard, and inside it, the single sheet of music in her own hand. Lady Maud rose to speak just as the solicitor cleared his throat to begin the reading of terms. The whole hall turned toward her out of long habit, the way a room turns toward the person who has outlived and outlasted everyone else in it. "Before signatures," she said, sweet as arsenic, tapping her cane once against the floor. "A little music." The room turned to her, delighted, expecting a harmless indulgence from a beloved old woman. A few guests even laughed softly, charmed. "Odette, dear," Lady Maud said, looking directly at the bride in champagne silk, and her voice did not waver at all. "That piece you told us at dinner several weeks ago that you composed yourself. Play it for us now." Before the ink, every face in that hall turned toward Colette Lachlan. Colette smiled. The same rehearsed smile she had used at a magistrate's bench 3 weeks later, the one that had opened so many doors, and walked to the piano because 100 witnesses left her no room to refuse. She sat. She lifted her hands over the keys the way she had watched her sister do 100 times as children, and then her hands simply died on the ivory. No sound came. Seconds stretched into a silence so complete that guests near the front later swore they could hear the fire crackling in the hearth. "I find," Colette said too brightly, her voice catching, for the first time all evening, "that my nerves have quite failed me tonight. Perhaps another time." "There is no other time, my dear," Lady Maud said softly, not unkindly, the way a surgeon speaks before the final cut. "There is only tonight." From the back of the hall, a tray of empty glasses set down without a sound on the sideboard. Odette Lachlan walked forward through 100 guests in her gray dress and white apron, and every head in that room turned to watch a maid cross the floor of a settlement signing, as though she had every right in the world to be there. Whispers started somewhere near the windows and rolled through the crowd like wind through wheat, one guest leaning to another. A dozen questions asked at once, and none of them answered. She sat down at the piano beside her own sister. She lifted her left hand, and the candlelight caught, plain as day, the hard yellow callus on her smallest finger, built by 18 years of scales nobody had ever asked her to play for a party. And then she played it, flawless. Note for note, the piece that existed nowhere on paper except the single sheet folded in her apron pocket and in her own 2 hands. The gasp that went through that hall did not sound like one gasp. It sounded like 100 separate breaths caught at once and let go together. A wave breaking across the whole room. Somewhere near the fireplace, Baron the Wolfhound rose from where he had been lying and walked, unhurried, deliberate, the whole length of the great hall, past the woman in champagne silk, and sat down at the maid's feet, resting his great gray head against her apron. A woman near the back fainted clean into her husband's arms, and nobody so much as glanced at her, because every eye in that hall was fixed on the piano. "You took my ring, my room, and my name, Colette," Odette said, still seated at the piano, not turning around, her voice carrying clean across 100 silent guests. "You should have taken the piano lessons." Simon Bird stepped forward from beside the doorway, where he had been standing all evening, and sat down on the settlement table, directly on top of the unsigned papers, a folded letter written in French and addressed to a solicitor in Zurich. "Found among the bride's belongings, my lord," he said quietly to Lord Evander. "Along with this," he set down a second paper beside it, "a bank draft prepared in the name of Lady Sherwood, drawn against funds that did not yet legally exist, dated for the morning after the wedding." Lord Evander Sherwood read both papers standing in front of 100 guests, his face draining of every trace of color, his hand tightening on the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. When he looked up from them, he did not look at the woman in champagne silk at all. He looked, for the first time all evening, at the woman in the apron, sitting at the piano with a wolfhound's head against her knee, and something in his face changed the way a room changes when someone finally opens a window. 11 months, he said, quietly, almost to himself, though the whole hall heard it in the silence. 11 months of letters. I fell in love with a woman who wrote to me about Chopin and chess and her father's old dog. I never once doubted whose hand held the pen. He looked at Colette. It was never yours, was it? Colette Lachlan understood, faster than anyone else in that hall, exactly what had just happened, and she did what a cornered animal does. She dropped the mask entirely, and for one raw second the rehearsed sweetness fell off her voice like paint off wet plaster. You have no idea what it costs, she said, low, furious, to spend your whole life being the lesser one, to watch her get the praise and the piano and the pity, while I got nothing but her leftover reputation to clean up. I only ever wanted to be looked at the way they looked at her. You were looked at, Odette said from the piano, quiet and steady. You were looked at your whole life, Colette. You simply never wanted to be seen doing anything to earn it. Colette ran for the door. She did not make it. Two gentlemen who had been standing quietly near the back all evening, sipping champagne like any other guests, stepped into her path, and one of them said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, Colette Aldous, alias Colette Lachlan, alias Madame Fontaine of Lucerne. You are wanted on a warrant from the canton of Zurich, and we are instructed to detain you. The champagne silk dress, the borrowed ring, the stolen name, every guest who had lifted a glass and toasted to Odette 3 weeks earlier now stood in absolute silence and watched the same woman led out past them in handcuffs, light enough to be discreet and heavy enough to be final. The crowd that had laughed with her at the garden party now simply stared, the way a room stares at a magic trick once someone has shown them exactly how it was done. It took 9 more days after that night for every thread to be pulled straight, which is how Odette Lachlan ended up, briefly, at a magistrate's bench in a Cumberland anteroom, standing beside a sister who would not meet her eyes, while a clerk asked which of them was Miss Odette Lachlan, a question that morning, still needed answering on paper, in ink, with witnesses, even though every soul in Lachlan Hall already knew the truth in their bones. Colette smiled at the clerk first, out of old habit, the reflex of a woman who had spent her whole life believing a smile could still win the room. It did not win this one. The magistrate looked at the pianist's callus on one twin's hand, at the dog waiting patiently outside the door for one twin and not the other, at the sworn statement of Lady Maud Sherwood, and the sworn statement of Simon Bird, and the letter to Zurich and the bank draft, dated for a wedding that would now never happen. And he did not need long at all. In the days that followed, the household ledger came out in the open parlor, and one by one the servants who had been paid, quietly, separately, in cash. To say Odette had spells and Colette was the real bride stood up in front of the assembled family and retracted every word aloud. Mrs. Pruitt went first, her hands shaking worse than Odette's ever had, admitting she had been given £11, and a promise of a better position to swear the new lady's maid was the one prone to fainting fits. Mr. Wren admitted the same, in a lower sum, and could not meet Odette's eyes as he said it. A footman named Collins admitted he had been given £4 simply to fetch a doctor that first morning and say nothing else, and wept harder over £4 than the others had over 11. Even the housemaid who had first curtsied to the wrong sister came forward and wept an apology nobody had demanded of her, saying only that she had been afraid and had not known, truly had not known, which sister was which until the piano. Odette forgave every one of them within the week because she understood, better than anyone, how convincingly her sister could make a lie sound like the kindest possible thing to believe. She kept every one of them in their positions, save the footman Collins, who asked to leave on his own before she could decide, too ashamed to stay in a house where the walls themselves seemed to remember what he had done. The marriage settlement was signed 1 month later, in a smaller, quieter gathering than the one that had nearly ruined everything, with the correct sister's name on every page in her own true hand. The bishop who had nearly married her sister to Lord Evander under a stolen name performed the ceremony instead. For Odette and Evander 3 weeks after that, in the same great hall where she had once polished silver in an apron, standing now at the altar in a gown that was entirely, undeniably her own. Lady Maud Sherwood, before the settlement signing began, walked to the tea table herself, lifted the sugar bowl with both hands, and removed it from the room entirely, setting it down out of sight on a side table in the hall. Only 3 people in that gathering understood the joke well enough to laugh: Odette, Lord Evander, and Simon Bird, who allowed himself, for the first time in the whole affair, a very small and very satisfied smile. Odette Lackland built her life back the way you rebuild anything worth having. Not all at once, but in the details other people bothered to learn about you. Baron the Wolfhound slept every night after that at the foot of her bed, in the room that had always been hers, and never once needed to growl at her again. The piano in the East Music Room was never locked after that, not for a single day, and Lord Evander had it moved, eventually, into their own new sitting room, where he liked to sit in the evenings and listen to the one piece in the world that only existed in her hands, until, at his gentle insistence, she finally wrote it down on paper for the first time in her life, no longer needing it to be a secret only she carried. Mrs. Aldous, the cook, stayed on for another decade, and was fond, in her final years, of telling the story of the loaf she had saved for a sad maid, who turned out to be the lady of the house all along, though she always finished the story the same way. I never doubted her for a moment, mind. Not for one moment. Nobody in the kitchen corrected her, though several of them remembered otherwise. She returned Evander's private letters to him herself, everyone, sealed again exactly as she had found them, and told him plainly, without excuse, that she had read 2 of them without his permission, searching for proof to save him, and that she was sorry for the line she had crossed, even while she did not regret, for one moment, that it had saved his fortune and his future. He forgave her for it that same evening, simply and completely, taking both her hands in his and telling her that a woman who crossed one line to save him from a lifetime of ruin had earned rather more trust than less. It was a forgiveness she found she still could not quite manage to extend to her own sister. Not yet, perhaps not ever, and she decided, after turning the thought over many times in the quiet of the music room, that some things were allowed to stay unforgiven a while longer, and that this did not make her unkind. It only made her honest. At their wedding breakfast, months later, there was one chair left empty at the far end of the table, and nobody moved it, and nobody pretended it was not there. Odette looked at it once, quietly, and thought of a girl who had once covered for her sister's every mistake and been repaid with theft, and felt, for just a moment, the strange grief of loving someone who had never once loved her back the same way. Then she looked away and turned back to the warm, crowded, noisy table full of people who had chosen, in the end, to believe her, and went on living the life that had always, truly, only ever belonged to her. You are kept alive, in the end, by the small details other people bother to learn about you, the sugar you never take, the song only your hands remember, the dog who knows you by something deeper than your face. A stolen name can fool a room for a season. It cannot fool a callous, a wolfhound, or a grandmother who was paying attention the whole time. Here is the question this story leaves behind, and we would love to hear your answer in the comments below. Odette read a good man's private letters, without his permission, to save him from a woman who would have ruined him. Was that a forgivable act of love? Or was it the very first step down the same road her sisters had already taken? You decide. This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.